Okay. So we'll start with our African Canadian history of enslavement acknowledgement. So we acknowledge all treaty peoples, including those who came here as settlers, as migrants, either in this generation or generations past, and those of us who came here involuntarily, particularly forcibly displaced Africans brought here as a result of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. Today, we pay tribute to those ancestors of African origin. So this evening, we have with us from Be the Change myself. My name is Jillian. We have Monique as well, who will be supporting in the chat and just seeing if there's any hands raised. So we do have eyes on the chat. So if you do have any questions that you'd like to drop in there, please feel free to go ahead and do that. And we'll also add our website and socials there as well. If you're not already following us, then you will have an opportunity to find that information there. And just for anyone that's not familiar with our organization, Be the Change is a nonprofit organization that was established in 2020 with the primary objective of supporting the needs of Black and racialized youth and families. We have two core programs. So our Black Girls Drop Zone offers is a program that offers the fostering a sense of identity and self-esteem in young Black girls. We currently have a session that's happening virtually, which just we had one just prior to this session this evening, and wrapping up our in-person session as well at Susan Fennell. We'll be doing a session in person out in Simcoe County at Shack's World. For anyone that might be out in that area, that's going to begin at the end of April. So that's something else to look forward to. And then we have our Parent Connections program, which you're all joining us here today through. And we have monthly workshops that provide information and resources for parents that are looking to get support in regards to navigating the education system. So those are the core programs that we offer. And then getting to our meat of this evening. So we have with us Dr. Karen Wilson, and Dr. Wilson is going to be our guest speaker. And just to give a bit of an introduction for her, Dr. Wilson is a clinical neuropsychologist at MindFit and host of the Diverse Thinking, Different Learning podcast. She specializes in the assessment of children and adolescents with learning and thinking differences. And she has extensive experience evaluating children, adolescents, and adults who present with developmental, neurocognitive, and social emotional difficulties. Dr. Wilson is also the founder and CEO of Child Nexus, a digital platform that provides parents support services for neurodivergence, learning disabilities, and youth mental health. They they disseminate practical, evidence-based information for parents and professionals on their Instagram account, which is Child Nexus Community, and we can drop that in the chat as well for anyone that wants to check that out. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Wilson. I'll pass it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jillian, for that introduction and for all the work that you all are doing with Be the Change. And I'm grateful to Monique for asking me to be the presenter this evening. And thank you for everyone who came today. I'm excited to have a discussion. Most of my work centers around kids who struggle with learning or their mental health. And I feel it's my job to figure out a way to support them so that everyone has the opportunity to thrive. So I start from there, and I will get started on my presentation. Everyone can see my screen. Feel free to let me know. I wanted to start by saying that I want to provide some information on how to support neurodivergent and unique learners. Neurodivergent, I mean individuals who have unique ways of learning information, processing information, or interacting with their environment. And a lot of those differences in the way individuals process information is tied to differences in the way the brain is organized. And when we think about our brains, we have each person has about 86 billion brain cells. And each of those brain cells is connected to 10,000 other neurons. And so we've got all of these roads and pathways in our brain. So it's no doubt that you would have individuals with unique perspectives, unique ways of thinking, unique ways of seeing the world. And for most of us, that translates in differences in preferences, differences in our motivations to do different things. But for some individuals, that can lead to struggles. Those differences can lead to struggles. And so I want to talk about this because from what I've seen in the research, what I've seen in the literature, what I've seen in my practice and colleagues who serve kids with learning and thinking differences is that neurodivergent students of color who think and learn differently are often overlooked, they're often misidentified, and they're often misunderstood. And so I want to talk about what it looks like when a child struggles. And feel free to drop in the chat if you've heard any of these, if you've got a child who struggles, have worked with a child who struggles, know a child who struggles, and you've had conversations with other parents, coaches, or teachers, you may have heard things like, he'll grow out of it. Right, he'll grow out of it. You're seeing something, difficulties with reading, he's a little active, but give him enough time and he'll grow out of it. It's because he's a boy. If anyone's heard those rationalizations, he's just a boy. All boys are a little more active. All boys are late in reading and talking. Just let's give it some more time. She's just shy. That's why she doesn't speak up in class. That's why she doesn't have a lot of friends. She's just shy. That's who she is. She went to a play-based preschool, so they didn't teach her the skills when she was in preschool, and therefore she's behind relative to her peers. It's because he's the youngest in the class. He's younger than his peers. That's why he's a little bit behind, or she's a little bit behind. She needs just to work a little bit harder. He's just lazy. Sometimes that's heard from parents. I've heard parents say, he's not doing what he's supposed to do, but I think he's just lazy. If he could just be willing to work harder, he would get it done. And other comments might be, that's just whatever the child's name is. That's just Jack, that's just Sharon, whatever that might be. Those are some rationalizations that I often hear when kids are struggling. Let me know. You can feel free to drop in the chat if you've heard any of those mentioned when kids have been struggling. And oftentimes when we use these rationalizations, we miss, thank you, Indua, for putting that in. We miss what is really causing the struggles. When we say, oh, she's just shy, he'll grow out of it, we wait a year. Oh, he's just a boy, we wait 2 years. Oh, he's just lazy, that's who he is, and we don't do anything about it, right? And the signs when kids are struggling are not always clear, right? They're not always clear. It's not always they're having difficulty with reading, they don't like reading, they have difficulty with math, they're hiding their homework. Sometimes it looks like kids who are really high strung, kids who, get really intense, get really anxious, get really nervous. They have difficulties with sleeping, staying asleep. They're up out of their beds. They're in your bed when they should be in their beds. They are delaying going to sleep. They're with lots of water and snacks and I need to read a book and one more. And sometimes you get upset stomachs or headaches. Sunday night, everything's fine on Saturday, everything's fine on Friday after school, and then stomach aches Sunday night, Monday morning before school, stomach aches, headaches, things like that. Avoidance of tasks. Oftentimes we think that he doesn't want to do his homework, he's just avoiding homework. And I encourage people to dig a little deeper into the why behind why a child might not want to do their homework, why they may be hiding their homework, saying they did their homework when they really didn't. Why would they be avoiding certain tasks? And sometimes that avoidance is with peers. They don't want to have peers over. They don't want to have do things with friends. They don't want to try out for sports teams. There may be some avoidance of different activities. And you might see some differences in their mood. Yes, boring is a big one. It's boring, right? School is boring. The class is boring. The teacher's boring. And there's usually a reason why something is boring, because obviously there are other things that aren't boring. Video games are not boring. Snapchat, Instagram, TikTok, not boring. So why are those things not boring, but some things are? So there's a reason behind it. Sometimes The behaviors that can hide learning difficulties are perfectionism, where kids are so worried about making a mistake because they've made mistakes in the past that they try to be perfect. So they write and then they rewrite and then they erase and then they erase it again. It's not on the line. The letters aren't perfect, and it shows up as perfectionism and can manifest into anxiety. A lot of kids lack confidence in their own abilities, in their ability to do different things. And for some people, for some kids, it can look like restlessness. They sit down to their homework and then they have to get up. Oh, I need to get a glass of water. Oh, I forgot to do this. Oh, I want to get one more thing. Oh, I'm hungry. Oh, I need a snack. And they're up and down the whole time. Sometimes changes in appetite. They're not hungry. Can be an indication that there's something else going on. And it might be in the learning differences realm, learning disorders realm, but it also might be in the mental health. It might be anxiety. It might be depression. It might be trauma. It might be something going on socially at school, bullying that is impacting them. And so there might be a number of different things that may indicate that a child is struggling. And kids who struggle at school are at higher risk for having mental health challenges. They're at higher risk for experiencing anxiety, which is the most common disorder, mental health disorder in childhood. They're more likely to have anxiety. They're more likely to experience symptoms of depression and have a lower self-concept. And in kids, when these learning challenges aren't identified, it's the impact on their mental health is even more amplified because they're struggling. They don't know why. They're getting the impression from teachers, from adults around them who give the indication to them that they're lazy, they're not working hard enough when they are, but they just don't know why they're not getting it, why they're struggling, and why they're struggling more than their peers. And underachievement is a huge red flag for children with learning differences, children with learning disorders, kids who are struggling more than their peers in reading, writing, or math. That is a red flag that there might be some difficulty with learning, some difficulty with processing information, or even a mental health challenge that's impacting their ability to access the curriculum, understand information that's presented to them, and to demonstrate what it is that they know. Okay, does this seem to make sense to everybody? Yes? Good? All right, so what do we do? What do we typically do when we see kids who are struggling in some of those ways? The first thing that we typically do is we observe, right? We observe the difficulty with reading. We just observe the hiding of the homework. We observe the stomach aches and the headaches before school. We observe the lower grades on their progress reports. And oftentimes we sit in this observation area for longer than expected, right? We stay in this area for longer than expected. And I'm going to explain what a learning processing disorder is in a little bit. So we observe the difficulties, but we rationalize it, right? He's having difficulty with reading, but he's just a boy. So we keep looking. We'll just wait and see. He's having difficulty with sitting in a seat and paying attention, but he went to a play-based preschool. All the kids played around. There wasn't much structure. So we'll just wait and see, right? She's having more difficulty with X, Y, and Z, but she's just Sarah, right? And so we rationalize the difficulties and we observe. I've had kids seen kids who've struggled since kindergarten, and the issue is not addressed until they get to 6th grade because they've rationalized all those years. They may have gotten them a tutor and thought that that's enough without really understanding why the child was struggling. So what's a better thing to do? What can we do? One thing we can do when we observe struggles in kids, when they're having difficulty with reading, they're having difficulty with paying attention, they're disorganized, they have a blank page of paper in front of them and they're sitting there for an hour and they haven't written a word. Or they're having difficulty following instructions and directions. When the teachers observe that at school, what we want to do is also validate it. Are we seeing similar difficulties with paying attention, with following directions and instructions at home? If we validate that by saying, you know what, I'm seeing the same thing at home. They're having the same difficulties at home that they're having at school. And the other thing, I talked to a soccer coach, and the coach is also saying that he's not paying attention. He can't follow the instructions. When I'm asking them to do a drill, everybody knows what they're supposed to do, but he doesn't know because he wasn't paying attention to the instructions. So we validate those observations to see, are other people seeing it too? And then what we want to do is move from observation and validation to assessment, right? We want to seek out an assessment. I know you've talked in this group about IEPs. You want to request an assessment of your child by the school district. Some parents choose to do a private assessment and figure things out on their own. Sometimes they'll go through their insurance to do that. And they do an assessment to determine why their kids are struggling. Once we know the why, then we can intervene and give them the support that they need. But oftentimes what we do is we spend too much time in observation. We can let a whole school year go by just observing and using that wait and see approach. Sometimes it's more than an academic year, and we never get to assessing why they're struggling and then providing them with the support that they need. When children struggle with learning, and someone asked about what is a learning processing disorder. A learning disorder is when a child is struggling more than their peers in a learning disorder, and is in either reading, writing, or math. Those are the three areas where they're struggling. They're struggling more relative to than they are in other areas, and they are struggling more than their peers. So they're having trouble learning skills in a regular classroom. So everybody at the end of, by the beginning of first grade has learned how to read. They have good phonemic awareness, good phonological processing, but a child who has still not mastered the sound symbol association, which is phonological processing, may still not know their alphabet, then they're having more difficulty, right? They're having more difficulty learning those skills. It can be in math and it can be in writing. They respond differently in a regular classroom. So with the same level of instruction that everybody else got, they're still having more difficulty than their peers. Autism falls under a neurodevelopmental disorder. A learning disorder is a type of a neurodevelopmental disorder. Autism is another one where individuals have more difficulty with social communication. They exhibit a lot of repetitive behaviors. They have inflexible thinking. They see the world and experience the world in a different way. So it falls under that same umbrella as neurodevelopmental disorders. And individuals who have a learning disorder or a disorder of processing information, which could be attention. So they have a different way of taking in information, understanding information, and they need a specific type of environment in order to learn. They need an environment where they don't have a lot of distractions, where the teachers can provide support for their attention. They need something else. So they may need specialized instruction. They may need accommodations in the classroom in order to learn. And they need accommodations and instructions given to them in a different way. And the other students who do not have a learning disorder or a processing disorder or a neurodevelopmental disorder, they don't need that level of support in order to thrive. Does that make sense to everyone? Yes, thank you. When we think about kids who struggle with them, we think about learning disorders. So learning disorders can be in reading, writing, and math. When individuals struggle with reading, one of those learning disorders is dyslexia, and we can talk about that. It's about 5 to 10% of school-age children have a learning disorder. That's a lot of kids. And about 13% of all public schools provide special education services to children. And the research shows that about 15% of students struggle but have unidentified and unaddressed learning and attention issues that impact their daily lives. Those are the kids who are being observed, but there's no intervention and there's no support for them. And many kids fall into that category where there's, again, misidentification. They're just a behavioral problem. They don't want to behave in class. They're just bored. We attribute a lot of things to them without looking deeper into why they might be struggling. The other thing I think is important to know is that 20% of children will have some diagnosable mental health challenge by the time they reach age 18. And the most common one is anxiety, an anxiety disorder. Also depression. You see that more as kids transition to middle school, more so in high school. But this means that there are a lot of issues that our children, our adolescents are facing. And when they are struggling with learning, it means that they're not able to capitalize on opportunities. And there's an opportunity gap. When we look at kids who struggle in school, they're more likely to not go to university, not complete a degree. They're not going to get the best employment and occupational opportunities. And we can't close that opportunity gap if we don't first close the recognition gap. And what I mean by that is that we first have to recognize and identify if a child has a learning disorder so we can provide them with the right support. Because when kids struggle with reading for a year, 2 years, 3 years, their whole academic year, they struggle with attention, focus, organization, planning for an extended period of time, they start to believe that they're not good students and that they're dumb and that they're not smart and that they won't ever be able to do the things that they're supposed to do. Then they stop trying. Then they engage in activities that are more rewarding and more fulfilling. And they're never able to really demonstrate their full potential. Does that make sense to everybody? I love this quote by Ignacio Estrada, who says that if a child can't learn the way we teach, then maybe we should teach the way that they learn. And I think that's really important because so many kids are not learning in the classroom because they need to be taught in a different way. And when we talk about, again, moving from observation to validation to assessment, and that involves some testing. It involves, testing reading, writing, and arithmetic to see if there is a learning disorder. But testing is not always necessary to understand why a child is struggling. If the struggle is related to anxiety, then oftentimes you can observe that and you can address that with therapy. And then if things get better, then you've addressed the problem, right? It doesn't mean you have to go through a whole psychoeducational assessment in order to identify it. But for many kids, observing and then doing this trial and error approach isn't helpful because you don't even know where to start. So why do an assessment? When is it necessary? I think that's important for everyone who's on this call to know, because some people might be thinking, when is it, my kid is struggling, or I know a kid is struggling, my nephew's struggling. When do you decide to do an assessment or to seek out an assessment or ask for one? And I would say that you do that when a child is struggling and you don't know why. You don't know why. And you've tried something and it hasn't worked. Nothing has changed and your child is still struggling, or the child in your life is still struggling. And the purpose of an assessment is to provide a guide for the type of intervention and support a child needs. So the goal of an assessment, and some parents are afraid of being labeled. That's the big one, particularly for Black families. They don't want you to label their child, right? I don't want you to label him as learning disabled, as dyslexic, as having ADHD. We don't want this record to follow them. And I would argue that the reason for an assessment should be to identify why a child is struggling, And when you go into an assessment, it's to figure that out. And sometimes that leads to a diagnosis. Sometimes that leads to a diagnosis of autism or ADHD or dyslexia or a language disorder or something else. It's also important to identify the severity, because the type of intervention and support that is needed will differ, whether this is mild ADHD, moderate, or severe, right? The type of intervention and support that's needed at school and at home is going to be very different. We also want to identify connections between difficulty. Sometimes kids are anxious, and that's why they can't learn, because they're so busy worrying about saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing, making a mistake, that they can't even pay attention in class because of the anxiety. Some kids are anxious because they can't read the words that are in their book, and they're embarrassed and they're afraid the teacher's going to ask them to read out loud, and kids will laugh at them, and everybody is doing their reading time and they are struggling to understand the text that's on the page, and they're anxious because of that. And so an assessment helps to identify the connections between areas of difficulty. And if there are co-occurring issues, if there's troubles with reading, a reading disorder, and there's also an attention issue, right? Both of those would need to be addressed. We wouldn't want to address just one thing because both are impacting the child. And the other thing that's often overlooked as part of an assessment is that we're also identifying a child's strengths. It's not enough to go in there and say, oh, it's definitely a reading disorder. We want to be able to identify what this child's strengths are because we can use those strengths to help them learn. I've seen kids who struggled, for example, with paying attention and listening to information in the classroom. We do an assessment, we find out that they've got an extraordinary memory for things that they see, an extraordinary visual memory. Well, now that we know that hands-on demonstrations, that visual pictures with manipulatives help them to learn in a way that it wouldn't help a kid who does not have that strength. But had we not done the assessment, we would not have known that that would be helpful for that child, right? And having this information helps us convey that information to parents and to educators who might think, oh, he's just not trying hard enough, or parents who think he's just being lazy. Now we understand why a child is struggling. And from that point forward, then we can develop an intervention plan. Does this child need therapy? Does this child need tutoring? Do they need a reading specialist? Do they need something else? But we now know what they need because we've identified why they're struggling. And from that point, we can create an intervention plan, a support plan at home and at school. So when we're typically doing an assessment, and it will differ depending on what the question is. These are all the areas that could be assessed in a comprehensive evaluation, but depending on what you're observing and what the teachers are observing, you might not have to do all of these. There might be a specific area that you'd want to look at. But the most common difficulties are usually in the area of attention and focus and executive functioning. With executive functioning, we're talking about, getting started on a task. Sometimes kids will have the homework that they need to do, but they have a hard time getting started. They have problems with organization. Their backpack is a mess. Everything. They've got banana peels. They've got scrunched up papers. They've got their notebook. They've got books in their bag. They've got homework that they should have turned in a week ago. They've got, reports and permission slips that should have been given to parents. Everything is a mess. And sometimes their room looks like a mess as well. So that would be disorganization, which is part of that executive functioning system. You've got sometimes some parents will say, my kid's really forgetful. I tell them to do something and I come back and it's not done. They're really forgetful. They forgot their homework and they printed their homework at home and then they left it on the printer and never turned it into the teacher. Or they have a test and they forgot the book that they're supposed to use to study at school when they should have brought it home. I see someone's getting triggered. And so they have those problems with organization, problems with time management, problems with planning. Those are all part of the executive functioning system. And some kids are forgetful because they haven't paid attention. You cannot remember something you didn't pay attention to in the first place. If a child is looking at a bird building a nest outside the window, they are not going to hear their teacher saying that you have a quiz tomorrow. And it's not because they forgot. It's not forgetfulness. It's that they weren't paying attention in the first place, which is different than a kid who heard it, paid attention to it, and then forgot what she said. Those kids will have two different interventions because one is a memory problem and one is an attention problem. But if you don't know which one, you will not know how to support that child. You won't know what is needed. We also, again, look at these areas because academic achievement will tell us if a child is struggling, again, with reading, writing, and arithmetic more than their same age peers. Are they below grade level? And this is where you see that profile of strengths and weaknesses, where you can see a kid who's got high intelligence, really a tremendous ability to problem solve, can convey and articulate what they want to say, can tie ideas together, explain things in an elaborate way, but then you ask them to write their answers down to a question and they can't do it. There's a discrepancy between their intellectual functioning and their ability to write. And that is the hallmark of a learning disorder in writing, which you can have, right? Kids who can explain all day all the things that they want to do and all the the goals that they have and explain to you what happened at school and explain these different experiences that they've had and what they might be do differently and plan what they want to do in life. And then they have difficulty reading information that's in a book, right? So again, they have strengths and they have weaknesses. And a good assessment will tell you and help you identify all of those areas. So kids who are struggling typically when they have a learning disorder, when they have a neurodevelopmental disorder, they're struggling because their brains are organized differently. Their brains are organized differently than their peers. Those attention centers of the brain, the parts of the brain that are responsible for paying attention, tuning out distractions, those areas of the brain are functioning in a different way than it is for individuals who do not have those struggles. So their brains are wired differently. It's not that they're not trying. It's not that they don't want to learn. Even motivation is impacted by different areas of the brain. We have different parts of the brain that are responsible for our motivation to do things that we don't want to do. When we think about reading, here's a good example of reading. This is a 9-year-old boy who has dyslexia. So he has a reading disorder. And what we know from the research is that individuals who have difficulties with reading that are related to dyslexia, they have a hard time sounding out words, right? And so, when the kids start learning phonics as early as kindergarten, they learn that the C makes the K sound, the A makes the A sound, the T makes the T sound. You string those sounds together and the word is cat, right? And individuals who are not do not have dyslexia can read the words and say them fluently and quickly. But kids with dyslexia have a hard time understanding the symbol that goes with the sound. And sometimes they will reverse letters, not because it's a visual problem, but it's because they haven't heard the difference between B makes the B sound and D makes the D sound. It sounds the same to them. And so they reverse letters because they don't understand that distinction. And typically what they do is what most people who, when they read, the left side of the brain, which is responsible for language, becomes active. So if you look at this picture, the white areas on the brain are the parts of the brain that are active when kids are asked to read what we call nonsense words. So they're words that they're forced to sound out because they don't make sense, right? So they're trying to sound out the words. And what happens is the right part of the brain, the left part of the brain is supposed to be the most active. You're supposed to see a lot of white activity on that side of the brain. But what you see in this boy, that there's a little bit of activity on the left side where you're supposed to show a lot of activity when you're reading, and there's more activity on the right side. What does the right side of the brain do in this particular area here? The right side of the brain is visual. It's visual memory. And so these are kids who see words as pictures, and they're trying to memorize visually what the words look like. So they might see a word like experiment. It starts with an EX, it's about this long, and they say experience. It's a good guess, but it's wrong. They're relying on the visual system to tell them what the word is, but they're not sounding it out. The left side of the brain sounds words out. They see a word, the cat, it's 3 letters long, it starts with a C, and they say car. Again, they make a lot of errors, and that leads to a lot of difficulties with comprehension because then the whole paragraph doesn't make sense. If it's about a car and you're saying cat, then it's not going to make sense. And so what we see is that the brain is organized differently, right? This 9-year-old is trying to process reading in a different way. But once we identify that this is a boy who has a reading disorder, who has dyslexia, then we don't wait and see because he's a boy. We don't wait and see because he went to a play-based preschool. We provide him with the intervention that he needs and that we know can change his brain and help him improve with reading. When we do that, we provide him with a multimodal phonics program, which means just intense phonics. We're teaching kids to learn the letters and the sound over and over again. We're doing lots of practice, and we're strengthening those pathways in the left side of the brain. This 9-year-old boy did that for 80 hours over an extended period of time. They rescanned his brain, and this is what his brain looked like after that intervention. After that intervention, that child was able to process information more quickly, more accurately, and comprehension improved because cat was not car, artistic wasn't, some other word that starts with an A. the whole paragraph suddenly made sense. And what we know from the research is these changes don't go away after they've been learned and after the 80-hour intervention has been stopped, because those pathways are there and they continue to use those pathways as they read. And with the intervention, these children get to perform at grade level in reading, their comprehension improves, their writing improves, because if you can sound out words, you can not only read them more accurately, but you can spell them more accurately, which means that your writing improves. Does this make sense to everybody in terms of why we want to make sure that we're giving kids the right intervention and we're not doing the wait and see approach, right? If we can change kids' brains with, and it's a reading program. This is a reading program. This is not stimulating electrodes. This isn't medication. This is having the right program to support a child's learning profile. But we have to make sure we identify why the kids are struggling so we can support them. Julie Washington, who's an amazing speech and language pathologist who does a lot of work on Black children who are with language-based learning challenges. She talks a lot about dialect and how it impacts language. She says, one of the things she says, and she says a lot of things, is you can't respond to the intervention if you don't get the intervention. So this is the response to an intervention. Once we know what the child has, right? Changes in the brain that result in improvements in reading and writing and overall academic performance. And a child who's more confident in their reading and can write better than they did before, they're less anxious, their self-concept is better, and they're at less risk for depression. But if they don't get the intervention, then they can't respond to it, right? We know that there are great interventions for kids who struggle with learning, but we have to first identify that the problem is there so we can get them the right support. Here are 3 graphs. The one on the top left is reading comprehension. B is word reading, so accurately reading words, and the bottom one is phonological processing, so accurately sounding out words. And the top blue line are typical readers, kids who don't have struggles with reading, and you look at them through grade 1 through grade 9, and you see those reading scores improve over time: comprehension, word reading, and phonological processing. The red line are kids who are dyslexic, right? And so they're performing lower than their peers across grade levels. And what we know is that discrepancy between a child who struggles with reading and their peers will continue. It will not go away by just observing, by just using a wait and see approach. You can only close the gap with an appropriate intervention. The problem is if you see a child who's struggling with, for example, reading comprehension, I'll use that as an example. So a child has a book in front of them, has a passage in front of them, and they're supposed to read it, and you ask them about what they read, and they say, I don't know. I don't know what this means. I don't understand it. They can't answer the questions correctly. If you don't dig a little bit deeper to find out why, you will not know how to support them. And I'll give you an example. Some kids are struggling with reading comprehension because of phonics. They can't sound out the words on the page. Like I said, car is cat, experience is experiment, and the whole paragraph doesn't make sense. So they can't possibly answer questions about what they read because they are inaccurately reading the words. For some kids, the reading comprehension is impacted because they're not paying attention. They're looking at the page, but they're daydreaming about what they're going to do after school. They have a basketball game this weekend. They're looking at the page, but they're thinking about something else. Something funny happened at school. You ask them about what they've read, or you ask a question and they don't know. And it's not because they couldn't accurately read the words, it's because they weren't paying attention, or they're distracted by things around them and they're not accurately reading all the information on the page. For some kids, it's poor working memory. Working memory refers to the ability to hold information in your head while you're doing something else, okay? So for example, a kid who might be asked to, I want you to go upstairs, brush your teeth, and put on your pajamas and get a book. And they go upstairs and they're sitting on the floor. You go upstairs to see if they're ready to read, and they're sitting on the floor playing with Lego. They haven't been able to hold all of those things in their working memory as they walked up the stairs and saw all those distractions in the room. Working memory also impacts reading, because if you're reading the first page and there's characters on the first page and then they don't mention them again until the second chapter, your working memory holds those characters in your mind. So when they show up in the chapter 2, you know who they are, you know how they're related to the other characters, you know their purpose in the story. poor working memory, you're like, who is that? What are they supposed to be doing? What are they doing here? I don't remember a person named Carol. And then they can't make sense of the story and what's happening because of poor working memory. For some individuals, they can read accurately. There's no difficulty with phonological processing. They can pay attention and focus. They're not easily distracted, good working memory. They're reading all the words. They finish the paragraph, but they don't understand what a lot of the words mean. They don't understand what does this word mean? I don't know what this means. And it's the meaning of the word that's impacting them. They can say it correctly, sound it out correctly. They've paid attention. They can tell you and repeat verbatim what it is that they read, but they don't understand what it means. For some kids who are older, it's more figurative language that they can't make sense of. When someone says, don't put all your eggs in one basket, they're like, I don't know what that means. I don't know what you mean by that. And so, because they're very concrete. And so that's a language, a receptive language problem. It's understanding what words mean, understanding what phrases mean. And that's why an individual might also struggle with reading comprehension. For some individuals, they have really slow processing speed. They're accurately reading, they're paying attention, they understand what the words mean, but it's taking them so long that when you say it's time to go to bed, or the teacher says, okay, turn in your papers, they've only read half of the paragraph that they're supposed to answer questions on. So their comprehension score is low, not because they had any of the other struggles, but they didn't have enough time to complete the information. Some individuals have a hard time encoding information from their short-term to their long-term memory, so they don't remember what they read. If, for example, they read the passage, they understood it because they have good receptive language, they paid attention, they read the words accurately, but then the next day, when they're asked questions about what they read the night before, they can't answer them because they forgot. And that's because they didn't convert their information from short-term to long-term memory. That's a memory problem. For some kids, it's a visual problem. The letters fluctuate on the page. They skip lines, things like that. And the takeaway here is that, again, all of these kids had problems with reading comprehension, but they had problems with reading comprehension for a different reason. And if the reason is sustained attention, then you have to address it in a different way than a kid who's not sounding out the right words, or a kid who is sounding out the right words, but who has problems understanding what those words mean. And unless you identify the reason why they're struggling, you won't know how to support them. Tell me if that's making sense to everybody. Feel free to drop it in the chat. And the same is true for writing. Some kids will have a blank sheet of paper sitting in front of them for a long period of time, or they'll write one sentence when they're supposed to write, a paragraph, and you're like, you've been sitting here for so long and you've only written one sentence and you don't know why. So for some kids, it's fine motor. Holding that pencil is hard, it's uncomfortable, their hand gets tired, and it's because of a motor muscle weakness. For some kids, it's a spelling issue. They can tell you what they want to write. They can explain, oh, this is a story that I want to tell, that I want to write. It's about this, and then he goes this, and then he does that. You say, great, write it down. And they write one sentence. Meanwhile, they've told you like 3 paragraphs of text. And oftentimes it's because they don't know how to spell. And so they write only the words that they know how to spell, which limits what they can put on paper. For some kids, again, it's an attention issue. They write the sentence, and then they have to, someone walks in the room and they're paying attention to that. A notification comes on the phone and they're paying attention to that. And they still have that one sentence on the page. Then they get up and they want to get a snack, and then they see their basketball in the corner and they want to play the ball for a little while. Same, one sentence is on the page, and then it's time to go take a shower and get ready for bed. And that one sentence is still there because of poor attention and because of distractibility, not because of poor spelling, not because of a motor weakness. It's something completely different. Some kids have problems with task initiation, which is getting started on a task, and they need some support. They need a nudge. They need some guidance in getting things started. That is an executive function. Other executive functions include organization and planning, which is so important for writing. Writing is one of the hardest tasks for kids who have attention issues and also have executive functioning struggles, because they know what they want to say. They can articulate that verbally, but the idea of writing it down is hard, because if you have attention issues, you have to pay attention. When you're writing, you have to pay attention to your spelling, your grammar, the organization. What was the prompt? What am I supposed to be writing about? What are the rules of writing? Topic sentence, supporting arguments, summary. And kids who have attention issues, can't hold on to all of those rules at the same time. So they get overwhelmed and they write as little as possible, right? They don't know how to organize all of that information. Some kids, again, we go back to the language, is that they have a hard time saying what they want to say because they don't know the word to use. They don't know which is the right word. And they have a limited vocabulary. And when you have a limited vocabulary, you have a hard time expressing yourself in writing. And so, again, the bottom line is that we have to understand why kids are struggling and to know how to support them. If it's a fine motor problem, we need to provide them with occupational therapy that will help develop those skills. If they have problems with executive functioning, they need support, either with an educational therapist or an executive functioning coach who can help develop those skills. If they have problems with attention and focus, we need to provide support for them. Sometimes that's behavioral support, accommodations in the classroom. And for some kids, when it's on the moderate to severe end, it might require medication. Expressive language requires work with a speech and language pathologist. But again, if you don't know why that kid has written one sentence, you don't know the type of intervention that they need. We also know that, again, one of the things I said initially, that neurodivergent students of color, our Black and Brown students, are often overlooked, they're misidentified, and they're misunderstood. They're at a greater risk of getting kicked out of preschools. They're often labeled behavioral problems when there is an underlying issue. And they're less likely to be identified, even though we think they're more likely. The research tells us that they're less likely to be identified as having learning disabilities, and therefore are underrepresented in those students who are getting adequate support. You find a lot of students who are in affluent schools, independent private schools, parents are paying for private assessments to make sure that their kids are struggling with attention. I'm going to make sure that they're going to get extended time so that they're going to do well on their tests. And oftentimes our racial, ethnic, and language minority students get left behind because they're told he'll grow out of it. He's just a boy. She's just shy. She's just a girl. And we rationalize and we don't provide them with the level of support that they need. And again, this is true for our students where English is a second language, where dialect is different than the dominant group. We attribute those difficulties to their background and not to a real speech or language impairment. We oftentimes don't even investigate to see if there's a language impairment that's impacting reading and writing. And if there is, then speech and language therapy can address that. But if we don't seek out that assessment for speech and language therapy assessment, we won't know that they need that level of support. We also know that racism, discrimination impacts mental health, and mental health can impact learning. If you're worried in the classroom, it's very hard to pay attention and to focus and to learn in the classroom when you're worried about just being discriminated against, if you're worried about being bullied. And trauma can present as attention difficulties, as hypervigilance. It can look like ADHD. And unless you have someone who understands that distinction, you can get kids who are, again, misidentified, misunderstood, and who are not getting the support that they need in order to thrive. You have a lot of kids who are acting out because they're struggling, and that's the only way they know how to deal with the struggles that they're experiencing, because no one is giving them the support that they need. Kids will say that they would rather be in the principal's office than sitting in class and reading out loud and having kids laugh at them, right? And so if the reading difficulty has not been addressed, they're going to act out, because that is less aversive than being bullied by their peers. And this perception of racial or ethnic discrimination impacting learning and impacting academic outcomes doesn't exist for white children who think that they're being discriminated against. So we know that we have to look at the whole picture. There are a lot of factors that can impact kids' mental health and can impact their ability to learn and their ability to access a curriculum in the classroom. And so we have to do a really good job of assessing for all of the things in order to provide them with the correct level of support. Because if you have ADHD and you're also experiencing racism, your symptoms of ADHD will be worse, because that experience will make you hypervigilant. You'll be paying attention to all of the things because you're worried about how you're being perceived. If I'm worried about being under, verbal attack, and that will lead to, again, paying attention to all of the nonverbal and verbal cues in your environment, and you will not be able to pay attention in the classroom. It can also lead to anxiety and lead to depressed mood. When individuals are depressed or they're anxious, it is also going to impact their ability to learn. All right. So I hope that the information I presented so far, I still have a lot. I'm going to answer your questions. At what age do we start doing these assessments? You can start as early as age 6, but it really depends on what the struggles are that you're seeing, how severe they are, and how much they're interfering at home and at school. And so again, it depends on what it is that you're seeing. And I do find a lot of parents are apprehensive about testing, and a lot of that has to do is because they're afraid of their kids getting labeled. And it really, you have to know that your child is in good hands. They're in the hands of someone who understands the nuances of learning differences, who understands that intersectionality piece. So race, culture, and neurodiversity, to know how it can impact individuals, and to have confidence that the information will be used to support your child, right? But we know that early intervention, early identification, and then intervention is more effective than waiting until children have experienced years of academic failure, right? Because that leads to more difficulties than not doing the intervention, right? Because what happens is kids who struggle in school, and because of a learning disorder, the learning disorder isn't addressed, they internalize why they're struggling. They attribute it to, I'm not smart, like I was saying before, I'm dumb, they're smarter than me, and then they stop trying. Why? They've tried before and they still get the same grade, so why keep trying, right? And so they stop trying. They look at other things to get validation. That can be scrolling on TikTok for hours and hours because they're not getting the message that they're dumb, they're not smart, homework in the way that homework does. And they may seek out friendships with people who don't care about school. In adolescence, we see a lot of students who will seek out use of alcohol and other substances like marijuana to self-medicate because it's the one thing that makes them feel good, because school does not feel good for them. And so they're more likely to seek out those opportunities to feel good when their issues are not addressed. So the difference between autism symptoms and learning difficulties, it requires, the symptoms are different. So learning disability, again, is a specific learning disability or specific learning disorder in reading, writing, or math. So you can have either of those three, which means you're having more difficulty in reading, writing, and math than your peers, and you're having more difficulty in those areas, in one of those areas, or sometimes it's two or more, than you are in other areas. So you've got an amazing visual memory, your attention is strong, but your reading scores are below expected levels. You're really struggling with just coding out their sounding words. That would be a learning disability. Autism, you have individuals who have trouble with social skills. They don't pick up on social cues. They're often saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. There's a motivation to connect with people, but they don't know. There's often an inflexibility. So they like things the same way. They like to do the same things over and over again. They can get very intense and very upset and very anxious when things aren't done a certain way. So that's that flexibility. They often engage in repetitive behaviors, either saying the same phrases over and over again, doing the same things over and over again, wanting to do things the same way. Sometimes they can be physical behaviors over and over again. And so those would be things you'd see in autism. You also can see some language delays in autism as well. And so you wouldn't see those things in kids with learning difficulties, because learning disabilities, because it's not reading, writing, and math. There are other things that are involved. And so you'd need a full assessment to determine which it is. But that's part of how you tease that apart. So again, if we go back to what should we do, and I'll peep over at those questions again, because I know you have a lot of them. And I do have time at the end to answer a lot of the questions. We want to move. We don't want to keep observing because we don't want to miss the kid who needs speech and language therapy or needs that reading intervention or needs that support for attention and focus or needs an occupational therapist because of motor weakness. We want to make sure we're giving kids the support that they need in order to thrive. When we don't give kids the information, the support that they need, they're at greater risk for the mental health challenges. Like I said at the beginning, 20% of kids will have a mental health challenge by the time they reach age 18. And kids with neurodevelopmental disorders, dyslexia, dysgraphia, which is a writing disorder, autism that is not identified, are at greater risk for having anxiety, depression, behavioral problems because they're avoiding the thing that is hard for them. They're oppositional. They don't want to do the homework because it's hard for them and nobody knows why it's hard for them and they haven't gotten the support that they need. So of course they're oppositional. And in the teens, they're more likely to abuse substances. And those are kids who are greater risk for incarceration, right? The jails are filled with students, with individuals, rather not students, individuals who have learning disabilities, diagnosed and undiagnosed. I think one research study showed that up to 80%, I think 70 to 80% of individuals in jails and prisons have some form of a learning challenge. And so we want to be able to provide students with the support that they need in order to thrive. We want to make sure that if they're struggling, that we don't wait too long to get them the assessment that they need so we can answer the questions and get them the support that they need. But we also know that there are things that we can do as parents and caregivers that we can do to enhance learning when they're struggling. We know that from the research that making sure that we are prioritizing connection with our kids, we've gotten away from that where families are sitting around the dinner table with their phones and they're not eating together and they're not doing things together and everybody is going their separate ways. Connection builds resilience. Community builds resilience. Our communities were based on community and connection and going to auntie's house on Sundays and having Sunday dinner and everybody being together. And those relationships and connection build resilience, right? So when kids struggle, they are more resilient, more able to overcome challenges when they have connection, when they have adults in their life who want to help them, offer to help them, provide not only academic support, but emotional support. That is the key to kids being motivated to work hard, motivated to go to that therapy session when they know that they are connected to an adult and they're getting the support that they need. We also know that there are a lot of lifestyle changes that we need to prioritize, right? When the kids are little, we pay a lot of attention to how much sleep that they're getting. We're making sure they're getting their naps when they're infants, and then at some point that changes. We spend 1/3 of our lives in a state of sleep. So it's pretty important. We need to sleep in order for our brains to encode all the things that kids learn in the day. That transition from short-term memory to long-term memory so they can remember it the next day happens when we sleep. That's when that process happens, is when we sleep. School-age children need at least 10 hours of sleep a night, right? 10 hours. They don't even need drop down to 9 or 9.5 until they're 16 years old. So their brains are still developing. They need sleep. And when kids don't get sufficient sleep, they have their alertness dips. They have difficulty paying attention. They don't remember information that they learned, and they're more emotionally dysregulated, right? Think of a toddler who hasn't had their nap, tantrums, emotional dysregulation. The same is true for school-age children and teens. It just manifests very differently. They need a well-balanced diet. They need all of the protein that they need. They need the green foods. They need vitamin C. They need vitamin D. They need magnesium. They need potassium. All of those things, right? So we want to make sure that we're feeding them a well-balanced diet because that is going to optimize their brain health, and the brain health is necessary for everything that they do. We want to be able to make sure that we are limiting screen time. There's a reason why they don't recommend screens before age 2 is because exposure to screens impacts the way brains develop. And the research is clear that young kids who are exposed to screens early on have lower language scores, lower academic scores, their attention is poorer, and their socialization is poor. And so we want to make sure we limit that, particularly when they're younger, and also have boundaries around them as kids age, because we know, particularly for middle school and high school students, it significantly impacts their mental health. They're at higher risk for anxiety, depression, and suicide, suicidal behaviors and suicide, the more screen time, recreational screen time they spend. And so we can impact their mental health by setting boundaries and limits around that early on so that it isn't out of control, right? So again, and I say this to say that these are things that we can do to support learning, to optimize attention and focus and memory and emotional regulation and enhance mood and making sure that they are less anxious and not depressed and have a good self-concept. These are things that we can do as caregivers and as educators to support the students and the children and teens in our lives. We want to empower students. When they're struggling, we don't want to say, you just need to work harder. You just need to sit there a little bit longer. We want to acknowledge and validate their concerns and seek out an understanding of why they're struggling, right? We don't want to dismiss what it is that they're saying. We want to understand so we can provide them with the right level of support for all of the reasons that I talked about in this conversation. We want to nurture a growth mindset for our kids. We want them to know that, kids have this idea that, oh, I'll never be able to do that. Oh, I'm just not a math person. I'm not good at math. We have to change that mindset for our kids, because we know that if we can shift from, I can't do that, I won't do that, I'll never be able to do that, to, if I work hard, I will be better at this, right? With help, I can do better. With help, I can understand this. We have to be able to shift that mindset. And that comes also with connection. Those two go hand in hand. And we want to be able to give them opportunities to develop their strengths and their talents, because those are things that are going to make them feel good about themselves. Those are things that are going to make them more motivated to try to work hard. If they know that the more I practice basketball, the better I get. The more I practice art, the better I get. That too will also apply to academics and other areas where they're struggling. So you can use that as an example for them. And then they also have this thing that they do that brings them a lot of joy, and then also brings them a lot of recognition for what it is that they're experiencing. Other things that we can do is we want to make sure that we're minimizing stress, particularly if kiddos are struggling with learning or struggling with their mental health. Stress can negatively impact that. High levels of stress causes high levels of cortisol to be released in the brain, and that can negatively impact memory, can impact learning, and high amounts can actually start damaging brain cells. And so we want to limit exposure to stressful events. We want to make sure that we're not, exposing and re-exposing them to images on the television screen or wherever it is that they might see images that might bother them. We want to make sure that we're paying attention to the ages that they're saying that television shows are appropriate for. So we're not exposing them to things that they shouldn't be seeing. We know that mindfulness and breathing can decrease stress. And I often say you don't have to be meditating for 30 minutes cross-legged on the floor. A kid who struggles with learning can take a few deep breaths before they get into their homework. If they're anxious around bedtime, take some deep breaths before they go to bed, engage in some mindfulness activities. It changes the connections in the brain. It alleviates anxiety. It can improve focus and improves emotional regulation. And so there are a lot of things that we can do to support our kids. Physical activity is another one. We know that kids need regular physical activity. Most of them are getting that in school, but an hour a day is recommended. Physical activity increases endorphins in the brain. It improves mood. It improves focus. It improves attention. It improves alertness. And there's a lot of benefits to physical activity. A lot of researchers have shown that physical activity can also be a treatment for depression and for anxiety and for ADHD. And so we know that's how impactful it can be. We want to I know it's cold right now, hopefully not for much longer. Outdoors, spending time outdoors as much as possible is beneficial. expressing gratitude. If you can do that around a dinner table, do that in prayer, do that before bed, all of that enhances mood, releases endorphins, and all of that helps the mindset and the mental health. Mental health and learning differences go hand in hand. That's why I always mention them together. If you're struggling with learning, it's going to make you feel more anxious, more depressed, and have a low self-concept. And if you're struggling with anxiety and depression, it's going to be harder to stay engaged and motivated to learn in the classroom. And so what we can do as caregivers is also model a lot of these habits, making sure that we're not spending and sitting in front of them scrolling on our phones, that we're opening a book and reading, that we are limiting our exposure to news, because when parents are stressed, kids are stressed. And the research shows that kids can pick up on that stress. Remember I said that when individuals are stressed, they have higher cortisol levels, and they can measure that. It's a measure of the amount of stress that people have experienced. And they did an experiment where they had parents rate their levels of stress, and then they took the cortisol levels of their kids by doing saliva swabs. And they found that the parents who reported high levels of stress, their kids had higher cortisol levels. So they're picking up on the stress of parents. And stress in kids negatively impacts learning and negatively impacts mental health. And so again, we want to make sure that we're modeling those great habits for our kids, the well-balanced diet, the sleep, prioritizing exercise. If they see mom going to the gym, dad taking a walk after dinner, you're modeling the importance of physical activity, right? And so those are some things that we can do. So, as we close out, I know that there's some questions. I'm going to get to answer them. I think Monique is going to ask some of the questions, or we'll go through the chat. But if you think about a garden, if you think about a garden, our gardens are going to be blooming in a few couple of months. There's a variety of flowers, different colors, different shapes, different sizes. But if you think about gardens, all these flowers may require different things. If you've ever planted a garden or been in a garden, you know that some flowers require full shade, right? They can't be out in the sun, in direct sun. Some plants need direct sun. Some plants need lots of water, and some plants are drought resistant. And so you can water them once a month, once every 2 months, and they will thrive. And just as gardeners adjust the care to make sure that every flower gets what they need, educators and parents have to provide tailored support to children who have learning differences, thinking differences, mental health challenges. We need to nurture them and provide them with the support that they need in order to thrive, because all of them will need different things. Many of them will need different things, and we have to be able to know what they need. So in summary, what I'll say is that if you have concerns about your child who's struggling, you want to communicate those concerns with educators. We don't want to delay in evaluating kids suspected of having a learning or processing issue, because we know that early intervention has the best outcomes. You don't want to wait until 6th grade when the dyslexia was there in 1st grade. We want to make sure that once we have identified the learning challenge, that we can make sure that kids can get the treatments that they need, the interventions they need in order to thrive. And we want to make sure that we know what their strengths are, because they're going to use those strengths to compensate for areas of weakness while they're building those skills. And we want to make sure that we are, again, once we understand why kids are struggling, we can provide them with support. Oftentimes the go-to is tutoring, but tutoring is usually just someone helping you with your homework. It doesn't identify the underlying issue that's causing the problem. And so we have to use what we call evidence-based practices. What does the research tell us works for kids with reading difficulties, with writing difficulties, with attention issues, right? Treating someone who has homework difficulties because of problems with attention with a tutor is not going to be helpful in addressing the underlying issue. So I hope this information that I shared was helpful. Happy to answer your questions and hear your thoughts and of what we've kind of talked about today.
I think we have some questions in the chat. I know it's been a lively chat on the side as well.
I saw it scrolling up. I was trying to identify some of them, but sometimes they were just going by so quickly.
Yeah, lots of good conversation, lots of support, and people offering advice and guidance to each other. So that's lovely to see in the chat. I'm just going to try to go back to the top and see if we missed any of the questions there. Some discussion around the assessment, and
Okay.
some people might have hesitations around having your child assessed, and maybe if you can speak a bit about like the benefits. I know you did talk about like we just want to find out, what the challenges are and how to support. But one question was about how often should the child be assessed? So I know like when applying to post-secondary, the post-secondary institution may not look at like an older assessment. So
Right,
maybe
right.
some guidance around that. And yeah, when is a good time to start looking into these assessments?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I wanted to put up the slide in case people wanted to get in touch with me, in case I can't answer all the questions. Some people like to shoot me an email. I do have a site that provides a lot of these resources, including a podcast. So there's a lot of information there. In terms of how often, after that first assessment where an issue has been identified, usually the follow-up is 3 to 5 years for a full assessment. But you can do a shorter assessment. For example, if you have identified dyslexia for the first time, and then you do, for example, that 80-hour intervention, you can do an assessment after those 80 hours, but it's only on reading, right? Because you don't need to do the whole thing. You've identified that it's not language, it's not math, it's not attention, it's reading. So that way you can track the improvement. The other thing is that the accommodations might change. So you use secondary school as an example. So a child who's had, for example, support in elementary school for ADHD or for dyslexia, the support that would be needed might differ when they go to high school, go to secondary school. So you might want to do a reassessment to determine, do they still have the same areas of weakness? Do they now have different areas of strength? What accommodations would be needed in a high school setting that may not have been needed in a middle school setting or an elementary school setting? And so that assessment would be helpful. And a lot of students also need an assessment when they're transitioning to university, because the universities will often have their own requirements needed to document the learning disability that it's impacting them, and the accommodations that are needed, because the accommodations offered at university level will also differ oftentimes from the accommodations in high school and elementary school. And so you want to make sure that that you're getting the assessment that has the right recommendations for each developmental stage. And kids improve in certain areas where they don't need the same level of support that they needed early on, and they'll change in terms of what support is needed. So that's important to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Related question, just a quick one. I'm not sure if you're aware, but do you know if the testing is available in French as well?
It is. A lot of the testing is available in French. Obviously, most of the tests have been normed in English, but they are available. They're available in French and Spanish. It's just the idea that you have to get a French speaking assessor, right? And so that's really important, because you want to make sure that this is not just difficulty with the second language, that it is an underlying reading issue that impacts both English and Spanish, or the dominant and non-dominant language. And so having an assessor that's fluent in both languages, target languages, is really important. Mm-hmm. So it's not only that the testing is administered in that other language, but the assessor should be bilingual as well.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Okay, so switching gears, John asked a separate question. So he's asking, to what extent does heredity or current environment affect our brain?
Yes, so they play a big role. ADHD and dyslexia both run in families. Anxiety runs in families. Autism runs in families. There's a genetic predisposition to those learning challenges and processing challenges. And so that can be seen. The issue with a lot of families is that sometimes, generations, they weren't identifying kids with ADHD. When I was in school, a lot of kids were put into a special education classroom where everybody was put in there because they were slow learners, but they didn't know why they were slow learners. So kids with ADHD, kids with learning challenges, kids with autism, behavioral problems were all put in the same class, but we didn't know why they were struggling. Some individuals struggled in school, have family members who struggled in school, didn't finish school, but they never knew why, right? They just thought that they weren't smart when in fact there was an underlying issue. I did an assessment of a child once, and when I went through the profile of dyslexia and what that their son had dyslexia, this is why he was struggling. We went through some of the brain pictures I showed you and talked about what that experience was like. The father said, "That was me. That was me." He was 40 years old, and he said, "That was me." And he said, "I wish I had had this assessment done when I was in school." So he recognized that he had the same challenges as his son, but it was just never identified, right? And again, we know that dyslexia, ADHD, autism, and even anxiety disorders run in families. So that there's a genetic predisposition. The other thing we know is that environment does play a role. Environment shapes the brain, right? And we know that the more enrichment, the more connections people have. The more people talk to you while you're a child. There's a lot of research. When parents talk to their kids, if you've seen parents who are in the grocery store with their little kids and they're talking, they're saying, "Oh, there's the apples and there's the oranges. Let's go. What kind of cereal do you think we should get?" And they're speaking to them. Their language centers of their brain are more connected than parents who put an iPad in front of their kids and say, "Here, we're at a dinner table, you play on the iPad, we're at grandma's house, here's an iPad, play this game," rather than engaging them in language. The language centers of the brain are more developed when we speak to kids, speak with kids, and that can impact the extent to which kids develop language disorders and even reading struggles later on in life. So we know that environment plays a significant role early on. Kids who are, deprived of certain experiences can also have more struggles. We know, again, diet, early exposure to toxins, lead can impact the way the brain develops. So environment can play a significant role. Trauma, stress, early on changes the way the brain is organized, which can put kids at greater risk for learning and processing challenges.
Okay. Long answer, right? To the
Yes.
question. No worries. So more questions around assessment. So I think you mentioned that you actually conduct assessments yourself. And then just some idea around related costs and any supports that you might feel that are available to assist with the financial aspect of private assessments. If you can't get it done through the school, because I know there's usually a lengthy wait list,
Right.
you're waiting years. So for parents that might have that option of accessing their private benefits, like what can that look like?
Yeah. So I don't have a private practice here in Ontario. So I work for another company. So, but I do know that if parents have private insurance through work, some of those insurance will pay for those assessments. There are also some organizations, and if you email me, I can give you that have like sliding scales and things like that for individuals who might not be able to afford a private assessment. And so, and oftentimes medical centers that train individuals to be psychologists and neuropsychologists will have opportunities for individuals to get sliding scales for assessments because they're done by students who are supervised by clinicians. So you still get a good assessment. The report is supervised and written by a licensed clinician, but the person administering the tests is a student under the supervision. So oftentimes the cost is lower there too. So connecting with, a university who has training programs for psychologists, that's another way to get it at a reduced fee.
And just to give a bit of an insight into the actual assessment itself, someone was asking, like, what does that look like? Does it happen over the course of a few days? And are they testing for a range of, of various, learning disability, autism, this sort of thing? Because they're in the chat, they're talking about, like, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. So through the assessment, can we determine, exactly what the child might be facing?
Yeah, and you can. And I mean, every assessment starts with an interview with parents because there's no point in if someone says my kid has great social skills, everybody likes them, they're like the mayor of the classroom, then and they don't have any difficulties with flexibility, then you're not going to test for autism, right? Because they've already two of the main categories have been ruled out based on teacher and parent reports, right? But they're struggling in reading. So now we know. And then you ask questions about, well, how do they do with this and how do they do with that? So that helps to give the type of targeted assessment that they need. If a person is saying, well, they struggle with attention, they're struggling with reading and their math, and they have poor social skills, then you're doing something more comprehensive because there are more things that seem to be impacted and seem that the profile could mean. But again, it always starts with the conversations with parents and teachers so you can make sure that you're assessing the areas of concern. Because some kids, for example, are really great at reading, where parents will say, they're the high top reader in the class, but they're really struggling with math and paying attention. And writing is amazing. And they'll bring in school reports of like a book report that they wrote that's outstanding. So we're not thinking about dyslexia or writing disorder, but we're really worried about attention or math or attention issues that can impact math. And so it really depends on, what kids are struggling with, what their strengths are.
And is it also possible to identify like comorbidities such as like ASD, ADHD, and also learning disabilities when we're looking at these assessments?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the more comprehensive the assessment, the more that you'll be able to, and that's again, it's usually the case where you don't know what you're looking for. You're saying it might be autism, but it also might be a learning disorder, could be ADHD. We're not sure. There seems to be some anxiety. That's when you're going to do something more comprehensive. And then the answer you should know at the end of that assessment, is it autism? Is it a learning disorder? Is it ADHD? Is it an anxiety disorder? Is it depression? You'll know at the end of that process what it is and how to address it.
Okay. And another question. So, my child uses art as an escape mechanism or distraction from the task that she's assigned. So, how can I curb this without her feeling deprived of her passion?
Right. I think you use the passion as a motivator. It's like, after we do this, we're going to get 15 minutes of drawing time, or we're going to shoot baskets in the driveway for 20 minutes after you finish this thing. So you use it as a motivator to do the less preferred task. Kids with, for example, attention issues often have difficulty with non-preferred tasks. They can pay attention as long as they're interested in something. They just can't keep on paying attention when they're not interested. So you have to kind of motivate them in that way. Set a timer for homework. As soon as this timer goes off, see how many math problems you can do, and then you're going to get this X amount of time to draw or to go outside or to ride your bike or to do this other thing that you enjoy. So you don't deny them that time, but you use it as a motivator.
Wonderful. And just to clarify, so the assessment that we're referring to, it would be the psychoeducational assessment, correct?
For more comprehensive, yes.
Okay. I think I'm capturing everything in the chat. I know we just have a few minutes left. So if there's anyone that wants to unmute and maybe ask one or two questions, then we can do that before we wrap up.
Yeah, and someone had a question about comorbidity, and which I think is really important because I think about, for example, dyslexia and ADHD, which often co-occur. 40 to 50% of kids with ADHD have another learning disorder. And one of the interventions for moderate dyslexia is an intense intervention. Sometimes it's 2 hours of, again, that reading intervention. But if you also have ADHD, it's hard to pay attention when you're trying to do the intervention, so you don't get the best outcomes. When you're thinking about intervention, you want to make sure you treat the attention first, because you want them to be able to pay attention to the reading intervention. Does that make sense? So oftentimes that will be one of the factors to think about.
I guess I'll chime in. Karen, this has been a great presentation. My name is Marcia, and I'm a principal. Hi, I'm a principal in the Peel District School Board. One great challenge, which you touched upon, are getting psych assessments done because of the long waiting list, and sometimes financially there's a barrier to get those psych assessments privately. Although people can go through benefits, if you don't have a job with benefits or you're unemployed, then you don't have that route, right? And so I was curious when I heard you note that universities who are training students, just like when we have interns for medicine, I never thought about that. If you could maybe share some universities, I was assuming maybe McMaster because they have a med school, but I don't know what universities that would be, but that's a great backdoor for a slide.
Yeah, if you email me, I'll get the list. And so I'll get that information to you.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll make a note to myself.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Karen, so my name is Nastasia. Thank you so much for this presentation. But for those, if we want to do an educational assessment, can we contact you directly? Do we go through your company? Like, how do we take that step?
Yeah, and so you have to, because I work for a company here, you'd have to go through, it's called MindFit. So you'd have to go through the company in order to schedule the assessment. But the other thing you have the benefit of with MindFit is they do free consultations. And so you can say you want to book a consultation with me. That's why we can talk about, what's been done, what kind of assessment is needed. We can do that before we jump into a psychoed, because there might be other things that can be done before taking that big step.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, and another question just in the chat. So are there any resources that you're aware of for parents with ADHD that have children with the same?
There are a number of people who, like psychologists who do a lot of coaching for ADHD, do help parents who have attention issues, executive functioning, because a lot of the strategies they help those parents build, they also can help them use those same tools and skills to help their kids. And so I know MindFit has a number of psychologists who do parent coaching, which is often very helpful for parents. I also recommend a number of different podcasts, which provide a lot of great information. There's an ADHD autism podcast, and it's called ADHD Autism Podcast. And she has ADHD and has kids with ADHD and autism. And she invites a lot of professionals to come on there to talk about parenting with ADHD. And I have a podcast, Diverse Thinking, Different Learning. We have a number of individuals who come on that podcast to talk about how to support their kiddos who have ADHD, and a lot of individuals, because we know ADHD runs in families, need that support as well. If you need a specific referral to someone who can provide support, email me and I will give you some names as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So again, Dr. Wilson's contact information is in the chat. It was just added there again. So you're welcome to follow up with her in that way. And we also just put an evaluation poll in there if you're able to give us some feedback. So this workshop spurred from comments and feedback from parents who attended the IEP workshops. So we definitely listened to and would like to present more workshops geared towards the information that parents and families are looking for. So if there's, something that you're looking to find out more information on, please drop us a line, give us some feedback so that we can continue to plan and execute these types of workshops. Thank you for dropping the website there as well. So thank you again, Dr. Wilson, for joining us. We will send out the recording to all those who registered for the session. So it's not too late. You can still jump on the website and register. We'll probably send that out in the morning. So even if someone else sent you the link or that sort of thing, you can just hop on the website so we can grab your email that way and be able to send you out the recording. Thank you everyone again for taking the time to join us. Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson, for the wealth of knowledge that you shared with us in such a short period of time. Maybe we'll have to have a part two to the session.
There's definitely more to say, but thank you so
I'm
much.
sure there is.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a great evening, everyone.
All right,
Take care.
everyone.